you so much for being here with us tonight. So I'm Danielle Martin, and I'm the author of Glimmer as You Can, which is my debut novel that released a few weeks ago. I'm going to hold it in front of my face because that's the only way it doesn't disappear in front of virtual Brooklyn here. Let's see. Brooklyn. Oh, I think we have it. There we go. There we go. So Glimmer as You Can is an early 1960s story, and it's set in Brooklyn Heights, thus the background. And we also take little trips to Manhattan and different places around the world because the book does feature a flight attendant on the infamous Pan Am Airlines. So Glimmer as You Can is historical fiction. It's also women's fiction. And it is the story of three dynamic women from slightly different stages of life whose lives intersect at a late night social club. And it's an underground social club for women that the men aren't really supposed to know about. And so I know that some people here might have read the book already or might be in progress. And so I'm going to avoid giving away any spoilers or any major plot points. So I just wanted to keep that in mind that I know some people might not have read the full book. So I won't go into everything in the book, but I am going to do a few readings and talk about the different characters in the book and my inspiration for it. So I'll start off with talking about the character who we see first when we start reading, whose name is Lisa. And Lisa is the youngest character in the book. She's in her early 20s. And so we can think of her as representative of a sort of young, naive girl who's getting her bearings and trying to find her way in the world, both professionally and personally. And so she is an employee for Pan Am. And one thing that I enjoyed focusing on in this book was the professional realities of women in the early 60s and what did that entail. So there's always this idea of, oh, wow, the glamorous Pan Am life of being a flight attendant and how they used to be on billboards and everybody wanted to be them and it seems so special. And I thought about that and what it must have really been like when I started researching some of the restrictions that were put on stewardesses at the time, and also just the general environment for women at the time. And so that's something I focused on in this book. And so Lisa has this job as a way of helping to support her family because her family is not of well means, but she's also doing it for a little sense of adventure to leave Brooklyn that she grew up in. She actually grew up in Bay Ridge. And I want to just make it a little bit interactive. And so I'm curious if anyone here is from Brooklyn. Feel free to unmute and tell me if you are from Brooklyn. Or you could type it in the chat. Just curious how many Brooklynites we have here. Okay, or is anybody just from, oh, I see SC says yay, so SC must be from Brooklyn. Is anyone else born and raised in one of the 5 boroughs or has lived in New York City? You could feel free to type in the chat or unmute. I'm just curious.
Yeah, hi Danielle, it's good to see you. I'm from Queens originally.
Yes,
so I kind of related to Brooklyn through there. Yeah, definitely.
Yes, and hi Linda. Thank you so much for coming, Linda. And Rosemary says Bronx girl. So yeah, Manhattan. I want to mention Manhattan.
Yeah.
Manhattan. Okay. So I've lived in 4 out of the 5 boroughs. I've lived in the Bronx, Brooklyn. I went to NYU, so I was living in Manhattan, and I've lived in Queens. I was in Long Island City and Astoria, and my parents were both from Brooklyn, and my grandparents lived in Brooklyn. So it was like an honor and a treat for me to set the book in Brooklyn, because I always just imagined what old time Brooklyn was like, with the Woolworths and the ice cream parlors and just the whole experience of being in it. So it was a joy to visit the Brooklyn that I never got to visit in the early 60s in this book. But going back to, oh, someone said, does thinking about moving to New York City in a couple years count? Jamie. Oh, and by the way, Jamie, thank you so much for coming. It's really great to have you here. So yes, totally, Jamie, that counts. Anytime New York City is in your head, that counts as living there in your mind. But so anyway, so back to what I was saying about Lisa in the book as a Pan Am flight attendant. So I want to do a little reading, and this is Lisa on the plane. And so we're getting into the headspace of, again, a young woman in her 20s. This is really like one of her first big jobs. She used to work as a waitress in a luncheonette, and now she's on the plane. And what does that feel like? And what are the expectations of the major airline for a young woman of that age? And I just want to note other things too that are discussed in the book, like there's certain weight requirements, right? She has to say just a certain way. She has to look just a certain way and be just a certain way. And there's a passage in the book where she's being basically bullied and controlled by the head flight attendant, who was called the purser. That's the name of the head flight attendant, the purser. So I'm going to go ahead and read. This is where she's sitting at the table with the flight crew in an airport about to depart. And by the way, they depart from Idlewild, which I know, as some of us who may have lived in the city and been around at that time may know, is the previous name of JFK Airport. So that's what Idlewild Airport is. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and read. So the air at the crew table crackled with pre-departure energy, especially once their energetic pilot joined them. As the rest of the crew engaged in high-velocity chatter about the nightlife, beaches, and water sports in Beirut, Lisa remained quiet, picking idly at her food. The co-pilot took observation of her silence. How about you, Lisa? Will you join us for some water skiing in Beirut? He was straight-backed in his airline cap, masculine. I don't know how to swim, actually. Lisa's cheeks grew red. I never went to summer camp. You don't know how to swim? Jane giggled. So Jane is the purser, who has like a little jealousy of Lisa because the co-pilot kind of talks to her a little bit. Nope, never learned. Lisa mixed together her mushroom sauce and chicken fragments. The co-pilot flashed her a smile, his teeth a shade of blinding white. Oh well, they have life jackets anyway. I think you'll do great. From across the table, Lisa felt Jane burrow her eyes into her skull, planting hatred like a seed. Lisa looked over to Betsy, who gave her a sympathetic look. Once on board the jet, Jane wasted no time putting Lisa to work on drink service. Cups in line, just so. Napkins, perfectly flat. A pour with only subtle wrist action, no ungainly movement of the arms. As the purser, Jane was in control. Lisa set the fine glassware down in careful rows as the plane's motors roared to life. The engines were deafening with heavy blasts, but Jane's hisses were louder. You need to offer everyone blankets right after they board, remember? Quick, it's chilly. Yes, ma'am. Lisa scurried to grab a stack of blankets, trying to maintain their crisp folds. Care for a lap blanket? She pushed the edges of her lips upward as she glided down the aisle, smiling at each passenger. Okay, so something I really wanted to explore in the book was the idea of the public-facing person versus like the private-facing person. And so if we think about Lisa's personal interior life versus the expectation that she basically look like a shining, gleaming example of Pan Am up in the air. So this idea of public versus private, and especially what was that like for women in the early 60s when if they wanted to gain any professional foothold, there was the expectation to create the illusion of having everything completely under control at all times. And they couldn't risk, because of having such a fragile foothold professionally, having anything else, any weakness being shown or any vulnerability or anything like that. So that kind of brings us into the next character, who is Elaine. And so Elaine is originally from England. So I enjoyed writing her character. I do have family members from England, and so I was picturing the accent in my head as I wrote, which was a lot of fun. And by the way, there is an audiobook version of this book, and so which is fun to listen to as well as reading it. But anyway, so Elaine is a little bit older than Lisa, so she's representative of a woman who maybe has her professional life figured out just a little bit more with some experience. She's slightly more mature, or she is a more mature character, but she is dealing with a very difficult situation at home because she's engaged to a man who is alcoholic and unstable. And so there's, again, this idea of how does she deal with the public versus the private version of herself, because she wants to gain more professional esteem, and she's hoping to become a fact checker at the Chronicle, which is a fictionalized major New York City newspaper. So there's this idea of how does she get to become a fact checker, and how is it to be a woman at that time working at a major newspaper in the city. So that's Elaine, and Lisa and Elaine, they meet by chance, which if you read the book, you'll encounter them in the first chapter, meeting by chance in the airport. But I'm going to go ahead and do a little reading of Elaine. So I was talking about how she is engaged to someone who's an alcoholic, which, by the way, when they first got together, she didn't know anything about that. It was later on that she learns about his troubles. So like some people might get into relationships and not really know how the person is at the beginning, and maybe the person might change, and that's what happened with her and Tommy. But she's afraid to confront him with her professional aspirations because at this point he's not capable of holding down a job, and he lives off his inheritance, and they both live in his Brooklyn brownstone. So I'm going to do a reading from her when she's walking on eggshells, figuratively, trying to be careful around him and not set him off. Okay, so this is one of the chapters. It's chapter 12, the beginning of the book. Elaine paced her bedroom early in the morning. She always had to be careful with Tommy. She waited as she made half loops around their bed. One wrong move might cut the spindle-thin fibers that held him in check. Her breath came quickly as she stared at him, asleep, the rhythmic rise and fall of his chest as he slumbered into the morning, his eyelids fluttering gently. In light of day, as he snoozed, Tommy's intensity was hidden. He made soft murmuring sounds as he mumbled in his sleep. She paced still more, and the minutes trudged by. She trod heavily, but Tommy didn't stir. He needed to be fresh for her news. Receptive. She would get him before he was clogged with the cobwebs of the day. She would reveal the news about her job at the very moment he woke. Now, she perched on their bed, bouncing a little, creating some motion. Tommy turned over in his sleep. After 30 minutes, she tired of this and went downstairs. The waiting was endless. Maybe she could leave the house for a diversion. She picked up the phone. She needed a breath of fresh air, someone different, disconnected from all of this. Lisa, good morning, my dear. It's Elaine. Oh, hi. Lisa sounded flustered but pleased. It's great to hear from you. Yes, I wanted to call. I'd love to get together. Are you free this morning? Okay, so this is, again, like this sort of public versus private facing experience. And so eventually, Elaine does open up a little about her relationship, but she's keeping it close to herself in terms of the problems that go on in this brownstone, which, by the way, is this luxury environment that Tommy inherited from his father. So we see this all playing out with like red velvet pillowcases in the backgrounds, and he sprawls around on the couch listening to jazz and that kind of thing. But so if we think about Elaine and we think about what situation she's in the beginning of the book, and she doesn't have a job, and she's not necessarily with him for his money or for the brownstone, but she doesn't know how to disentangle herself in a way that's feasible. And so when I was writing this book, I was also thinking about certain issues that people might have had to deal with in terms of relationships that, of course, people still deal with today, in terms of having a partner who's alcoholic or otherwise a partner that is addicted to some substance. And obviously now there's a lot more help than there was at that time, even though it's still not easy at all for people who are in those situations. And so how about at that time when help was almost unheard of? And when I started doing research about what sort of facilities were available at that time in terms of treatment, there were very few and it wasn't widely known. And so this is basically the background that Elaine is dealing with, but she's more than just Tommy, she's her own person. And so this is just what's simmering and playing out as she's trying to find her own way. She's also a poet. She's very artistic. She has a sister who is a jazz singer, and so she comes from a sort of artistic family. I've heard the ladies in this book described as sort of bohemian characters, which actually nothing else can make me happier than describing them like that, because that's exactly what I wanted to convey. They're sort of artistic free spirits. And so even Lisa, who is expected to be very rigid and expected to be this perfectly trained stewardess, that she eventually encounters the other ladies and becomes more bohemian herself, or just maybe more open to experience and liberated. And so that's where I'm going to bring in another character of the book, which is actually not a person, but a place, the Starlight dress shop. And so for those of us who have read the book, we know that Starlight transforms into an underground social club at night. And this is where the ladies meet up. And the proprietor is named Madeline. So Madeline started the Starlight as a dress shop, and she eventually came up with the idea to make it an underground club as a result of trying again to forge her own as a woman in that era and gain camaraderie. And she's also getting out of a very toxic relationship with a politician. And so again, not easy for a woman to disentangle herself, especially from a prominent man, and especially during that period of time. And so throughout the book, there's a lot of drama relating to that, and what would that have been like for a woman to try to escape that situation. But Madeline is trying to do that through creating this social club, which again is sort of the bohemian space, but it's also magical. And if you think about my background here, picture one of these buildings and picture the neighborhood at night. And the first time that Lisa encounters Madeline's Starlight is at night when all the lights are down, and she just sees this one window and it's lit up in while the rest of the commercial district is sleeping. And so picture her coming out of her car. She's all bleary-eyed from flying on a transatlantic flight, and she's coming late at night into this neighborhood, and she sees this, and it's the early 60s. So what is this dress shop doing open late at night? She has no idea, but she opens the door and she sees all of these women, and they're dancing, they're having a great time, they're doing the twist, they're listening to records, they're playing card games, they're laughing, they're joking, they're talking about politics, they're talking about poetry, they're reading poetry, they're discussing the news. So basically, it's a haven. It's a haven for women. And so Madeline is the one who made this haven happen. And as I said, originally, she started it for herself as a way of creating her own space, but then it extended to the community in terms of these women. So I'm going to go ahead and read a little portion from Madeline. Okay, so this is the Starlight, has all of these different theme events that Madeline comes up with just to make every day feel special. And so this is where they're having their big Valentine's Day party. So I'm going to go ahead and read from there. The Starlight's first Valentine's Day bash had been a last-minute affair. The ladies had listened to the radio and nibbled on Madeline's homemade cupcakes in decorous avoidance of the burn parts. But now they were at the 5th annual bash, a startlingly different affair. It was a big and beautiful hoopla with 3 kinds of strawberry cakes, 4 varieties of cocktails. Thousands of pieces of pink confetti fluttered through the air like rosebuds. This night was alive with dazzling music. Catherine Huxley worked at full strength, belting out her gorgeous songs for hours on end. A clear and powerful jazz singer, she concluded her sets with flourishes of her delicate wrists. Between these sets, Madeline set Elvis on the turntable. Then, at 11 o'clock, it was rhyme and rhythm time. Elaine Huxley read her poetry, and the rest of the literary circle presented the audience with works about love, lost and gained. Now I'm going to just skip ahead a little bit to, this is a portion of this chapter that's a little bit symbolic in terms of what does Madeline represent to everybody. So, everybody was giddy at midnight. They laughed until salty tears flowed from their eyes into their drinks. They giggled into their cocktails and nearly snorted them backward. In chokes and sputters, it didn't matter. Someone put Elvis back on, and Madeline took out the roses she had bought for a couple of dollars on the avenue and stored in the back room all day. She passed the roses to the women, who began to toss them on one of her mannequins, and then someone made a sign for the mannequin's neck, Aphrodite. More and more women joined in. Soon, Aphrodite was transformed into a goddess in full bloom, strewn in an array of crimson petals. Madeline posed next to the mannequin, beckoning everyone onward, and the ladies took the cue to decorate her, too. She became their own goddess in full bloom as the ladies sprinkled rose petals on her hair, gathering the petals back up from the ground in a chorus of laughter, then showering her in a floral cloud. So when I wrote that passage, I was thinking about what does it mean to have someone who can gather everybody together? And of course, it's an interesting time to read about this club when we can't gather together in real life, but we are gathering together here right now, right? So that's kind of like the great thing about that we could still do that to an extent. But I hope that if you read this, when you read this, if you have read this, that it's also, there's a lot of moments of different kinds in this book. There's a lot of dark moments. There's also a lot of really light and happy moments. There's a lot of joy and there's a lot of pain. And so I really just wanted to communicate the full range of experience, and also, again, the different restrictions placed upon women during that period of time, and some possibly now, and the idea of how do they move past that? How do we move past that? What were they up against? How did they struggle, and what did they achieve? So that was really my goal in writing this book. And I'll talk to you a little bit now about my inspiration for the book, like what first gave me the idea. So it started actually while I was in New York University. I went to the film and TV program, and I was encouraged. This was, let's see, about 15, 16 years ago. It was my senior year. I was keeping a portfolio of ideas. And so my professor had recommended that everybody write down ideas. And so I wrote down ideas actually for future films or screenplays, or maybe even at that time, short stories that I was writing. And so I wrote down a single line that was inspired by a phone call I had with a family member who had told me that he had visited a late night barber shop in Brooklyn, which I thought was so interesting. And I was picturing this really social scene in the darkness of just men walking up to get their haircuts. And I was wondering what that would entail. And so I wrote down in this portfolio, late night barbershop in Brooklyn. And I just kept it with me. I moved to different homes, and I just kept this portfolio to inspire me for the future. And then it was around in 2014, and I was ready to write a novel, and I kept hearing different things on, I kept hearing different things on the news. Sorry, it just came across that it said my internet was unstable. So I'm sorry if it broke up for anybody. But I kept hearing different things on the news about different politicians who were cheating on their wives. And it felt like every day there was a different story about some prominent man who was caught in a compromising position. And at the same time, women who were trying to run for office kept being criticized about what they were wearing or this and that. And I just kept thinking about this whole idea of what happens in terms of women if they were trying to do something or gain esteem, and what happens to these men, what were the consequences for them. And so then I was like, well, let's see, I really wanted to write about the time period that was the juncture between the sort of looser Woodstock era in the later 60s and the 50s that were seen as more of the sort of staid years. And so I was interested in writing about that time period when people were like, maybe women were breaking free a little bit more, but not quite there yet. And so then I took this idea about this late night barbershop, and I said, what if I apply it to women? What if it's a women's club? And what if it's seen as somehow dangerous because women were not supposed to be out late at night? And what would that be like if a woman is alone in the neighborhood going to someplace else? Ooh, scandalous. And then I said to myself, and then it got me really annoyed and agitated. I'm like, why should that be scandalous? All they're not doing anything wrong. And so I guess the book was sort of born out of this idea of like, why should this be a problem? This shouldn't be a problem. They're just trying to make fun for themselves. And why should this be an issue, them walking down the street at night and trying to do this? So that's where I came up with the book. And I know that in the past, I've had questions, what inspired you for the particular characters? And I'll say that I'm a very visual person in terms of how I develop my ideas or scope of what characters look like and act like. And I went scouting across the internet, and I found actually some pictures of people. So if you ever follow me on social media, I posted them one time. I made a whole inspiration board with some pictures of people from the early 60s that were rocking the early 60s fashions, but I was looking at their faces and I was looking at their expressions, and I started to build different characters around them. And then also I wanted people who were of slightly different generations. So I wanted women, a young woman, a woman who was in her late 20s, and then a woman who was in her early 40s. And I wanted them all to interact, and I wanted them to come from different professional angles. And so that's where the book was born. So I would love if anybody has any questions, you can feel free to either type it in the chat, or you can go ahead and, I don't know, Julie, how you want to organize the questioning, but.
So yeah, first of all, I'm going to take you off Spotlight. Thank you so much. That was so great. I'm going to take you off Spotlight, and that way we can all see each